Thanks. Thank you very much, Wendy. And I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very grateful to have been invited. I'm going to give a rather breathless talk because I have the hope that I can reserve the last 15 minutes for interactive questions. But don't worry, everything that I say, I'll say probably 3 times. So it's about designing the optimal open access mandate, but I decided to rename the talk after I got a series of 9 questions from Bill Moen. It's now how the optimal open access mandate can help UNT reach Tier 1. I want to start by thanking Bill for inviting me and for doing this. It's absolutely a remarkable event that you've arranged here, and I hope that its outcome will be even more remarkable. I also want to thank Wendy, of course, for inviting me. Who is? I decided to use that one because it was more prevalent, but I see that it's not the most up-to-date version of you. I of course know about that article that Wendy mentioned, but she modestly failed to mention that it's in fact a highly cited and influential article. If you look up in Google citations, I mean, the usual article gets between 0 and 5 citations, and half of those are from the author. This one has made quite an impact, and in fact it's related to the theme of my talk, because this is really about the usage and the uptake and the impact of research findings. Also, Wendy's research, as she said, is related to my own. It's still going on. We have a summer institute on the origins of language that's going to take place to celebrate the I think it's now I can't do the arithmetic on the stage, but 35th year since the New York Academy of Sciences, is that right? 1975? The New York Academy of Sciences conference on this, which opened up the topic after a 100-year moratorium. It was still, the moratorium was apparently still alive when Wendy submitted her paper to the linguistics journals, but the moratorium originated in the Société de Linguistique of Paris, which said no more papers on this topic, it's too speculative. And of course there have been a lot of developments since then, and Chomsky, sort of a second-order mentor of Wendy's, is partly responsible for these developments. Moreover, it's connected with open access. If I haven't got time to talk about it, but if you look up the 2 articles over there, you'll see that there's a connection between the evolution of language and the milestones in the evolution of language and the kinds of things that are happening right now with the advent of the online era and the open access era. These are my collaborators. I should point out that those services that Wendy mentioned, although I sort of provoked them, I certainly didn't technically do them. Tim Brody and Les Carr are responsible for the technical work in most of the things that Wendy mentioned, and I have collaborators in all of these other things, and Alma Swan especially sends her greetings to everybody. She wishes she could have been here as well. Now, as I say, things are going to be said 3 times here, so don't worry if you don't get it the first time. Some of the points that will come out are the seemingly tiny but crucial details, like whether your policy should be a request policy or a require policy. It makes a big difference. And whether you should adopt a deposit mandate or a permission mandate or both. And there's also important details about the relation between university mandates and funder mandates, and about locus of deposit, where you deposit. This will come up, and if it doesn't come up sufficiently, you can reintroduce these in the question session, which I hope I talk fast enough to get to. I'm not going to be talking about gold open access. I'll define gold open access in a second, but I want to right now speak to it in the sort of tongue-in-cheek way that I've come to refer to it. There's been a kind of a open access itself, which I haven't yet defined, is coming very slowly, but it's coming, and there are signs now that it's really accelerating. One of the ways to provide open access is gold open access, which I'll define in a moment. But the trouble is that gold open access has produced a kind of a gold fever and a gold rush. You'd think that's good, because if things are going slowly for open access, it's good if somebody's rushing. But the trouble is that the gold rush is not really getting anywhere, and it's not likely to, and I'll tell you why. For the time being, gold will have its day. But one of the slogans of this talk should be that you need to have green before you have gold. One of the take-home messages for those of you who are advising on policies here at UNT and elsewhere is don't pay for golden open access without first mandating green open access. And that applies to things like the COPE and the Scope 3 program, which I may or may not get a chance to talk about again. Bill sent me a series of 9 questions, which I'm really going to rush through now because my talk is an answer to these questions. He asked first, what's open access in a university setting and what's meant by the open access movement? Open access means free online access to refereed journal articles, and the objective of the open access movement is to get refereed journal articles freely accessible online. Why are universities thinking of developing an open access policy is important at this time? It's because it's possible. It's possible. The internet has made it possible. In fact, it's overdue. I think everybody's recognizing that it's inevitable that it's going to happen and that it's optimal for research. It's just a question of when it's going to happen, and now's the time for it to happen. And as you'll see, the mandates are being adopted. What are the benefits? I'll be showing you that the benefits, in addition to the ones that Senator Cornyn mentions, which is that the taxpayers who fund research should be able to access the results of that research. In addition, and in my opinion a lot more important for taxpayers, is the fact that those for whom most of that research is written and intended, namely its users, namely researchers and those who are in a position to apply the research to the benefit of the taxpayer, that they should be able to access it. Right now, the only ones who can access the research findings are those whose institutions can afford subscription access to the journal in which it was published. And the idea of open access is to make it accessible to all of the intended users, and not just those whose institutions can afford to subscribe to the journal in which it was published. I don't know what a hot button issue is, so I'm going to take the button to be the kind of thing you press on a keyboard, and I think the issue is that getting those fingers of researchers moving on the keyboard so that they provide open access to the research they've done and that they've published. What are the anticipated costs to the university and individual faculty members? To the university, next to nothing, especially a university like UNT that already has a digital repository for many reasons, has already invested in it, and it's largely empty, I'll warrant, of UNT research output for the time being, because UNT doesn't yet have a mandate, and therefore it's the same as most of the other repositories worldwide, which are nearly empty because they don't have mandates. So as an additional cost to having you already have the repository, all you have to do is adopt a mandate, and your repository will fill, and I'll give you evidence for that as well. To faculty members, it costs what I just said, hot button keystrokes, about 6 minutes worth of keystrokes per paper. So for a prolific researcher who publishes between 4 and 6 papers a year, that's about an hour's worth of keystrokes. That's what it costs. After open access, what's next on the horizon? Well, the next thing on the horizon is actually open access metrics, ways of, Senator Cornyn mentions this as well. He mentions it in connection with taxpayers funding research, but this is true in other ways through our institutions. Institutions in performance evaluation and research funders in funding research are interested in the importance and the impact of the research that they're funding. Open access metrics will make it possible to help measure that, and not only measure, but even sort of predict the directions of that kind of usage and impact. And in addition, and I won't have time to talk about it, there's also the commentary layer, the journal that Wendy mentioned, Behavioral and Brain Sciences, which Wendy neglected to mention that that journal doesn't accept Wendy didn't just submit her article and then it was accepted and sent for commentary. It went through a rather rigorous refereeing phase. And so there's a very rigorous form of classical peer review beforehand, but once it's accepted, then it goes for open peer commentary. And that open peer commentary, I always felt while I was editing BBS for a quarter century, was a mechanism waiting for its time. The Gutenberg mechanism of taking these preprints, as we did in Wendy's day, and sending them in paper around the world to the researchers to comment on it was not optimal. The web was the way that it was meant to be done, and more and more that's the way it's being done, but the next step is to make sure that the target article itself is accessible to everyone. So the next phase is commentary, and I think that's what's going to develop in new and revolutionary ways. Provide an overview of similar academic... Yes, I will, in fact, talk to you about other academic institutions and funders that are also adopting policies. Are there any legal issues? Short answer, zero, none. Worries about legal issues are among the top 3 retardants on the growth of open access, and they're all based on misunderstandings. I hope I'll be able to clarify them during my talk today. How might open access play into UNT's push to gain Tier 1? Well, I hope I'll be able to answer that question as well. What's open access? First of all, what isn't open access? It is not about copyright reform. There are relationships between the open access issue and copyright reform, and it will lead to copyright reform, but open access does not mean reforming copyright in such a way as to make everything open access. It's important that you understand that. It's not about publishing reform either. As I said, golden open access publishing is likely to happen eventually, not necessarily certain. It's not certain that it'll happen, but it's likely to happen. But that's not what open access is about. Golden open access publishing, which I'll talk about very little during this talk, it's when instead of the author making the article, the published article freely accessible to everyone, it's the journal that makes it freely accessible to everyone. And most golden open access journals today are subscription journals that simply make their online version accessible to everybody for free. That's gold open access. But it's only available for about 20% or less of refereed journals, and not really the top 20%. In fact, a lot of journals that are valuable, but not in tremendous demand, and so they supplement their usage by making their online version for free. But the top journals, the ones that everybody needs and wants, most of them are not open access. There are some exceptions, of course. The Public Library of Science journals are excellent. They're absolutely top tier, PLOS Biology and PLOS Medicine. And Biomed Central has some very good journals too, and so does Hindawi. But in general, if you look at the golden open access journals, very few of them are top tier journals. So it's not about getting publishers to go gold. Publishers will go gold if and when they choose to, and that's fine. It's about making the articles themselves open access, and that's green open access. It's definitely not about peer review reform. Many people have misunderstood and thought that somehow open access meant the end of peer review or some sort of a radical change in the way that peer review is implemented. Not at all. It's a supplement to an important supplement to classical peer review, and classical peer review is still essential to peer-reviewed publishing, almost by definition. And it's not about digital preservation. Of course, digital preservation is important, and you have to preserve the open access contents, but you have to remind yourself, especially for green open access, which is what I'm here to talk about, the self-archiving of authors' final peer-reviewed accepted drafts upon publication. Those are not the canonical version of the article. They're just the author's final draft. Yes, it's important to preserve them so we can keep on having open access to them, but the preservation burden is not on that draft. It's on the canonical draft, the version of record, which is with the publisher and with the deposit libraries. So don't conflate open access with digital preservation. And finally, despite Senator Cornyn's optimistic and right-minded letter about making knowledge accessible to everyone, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because knowledge comes in lots of forms, some of it proprietary, some of it patent-based, some of it confidential. There are bigger issues with making all knowledge open, and there are issues that should certainly be confronted, but open access is more modest than that. To repeat, it's about, in the first instance, it's about the articles that appear in peer-reviewed journals and not about all knowledge. And the important thing about articles that appear in peer-reviewed journals is that their authors want to give them away. That's not true, as you'll see in a second. That's not true about a lot of other kinds of content, much of which is also knowledge. So open access is free, immediate, permanent, full-text, online access. But open access to what? In the first instance, it's the 2.5 million articles a year, that's just an estimate, that appear in the 25,000 peer-reviewed journals that are published in all disciplines in all languages, in all subject matters, and in all countries. That's the primary target. The other things in red on the other side are potential candidates. There are people like Cory Doctorow who are making their books, for example, freely accessible online, but they're certainly not the majority. Whereas in the case of the 2.5 million articles in the 25,000 journals, there is not a single author, and I say this without any fear of being contested, there's not a single author of a single one of those peer-reviewed articles who wrote it for revenue, that is to say, to be paid the way that book authors sometimes hope to get royalty revenue. Those are all research articles that are published for the sake of research, uptake, usage, and impact. The way that yes, the articles matter for the researcher's career, but not by having tolls collected in order to have access to the article. On the contrary, the fact that there are toll barriers to those articles is harmful to the career of researchers and harmful to the progress of research, and that's what open access is about. It's not true about these other kinds of contents, though. Many books, most books, are not just written for usage and impact, and that's especially textbooks. Magazine articles are often work for hire. Newspaper articles, work for hire. Music, video, those are not things that their creators, especially maybe at the beginning of their careers, they're trying to give it away in order to make a name, but they're certainly not hoping to be producers of giveaway content the way all researchers are in their peer-reviewed work. Same with software. My heart is with the free software movement and the open source movement, but I know that there are a lot of computer scientists who are interested in making money from the software that they write, and they don't want to give it away. And for that reason, it's not true about all knowledge. It's simplistic to say that open access is about making all knowledge free. These are all of these categories and more are examples of knowledge, but it's not as an open and shut a case as it is with the single exception-free target of open access, which is refereed journal articles. Same with data. The research data that accompany journal articles are also things that authors don't normally sell, but they do want to have exploitation rights, if you like. If you take the trouble to gather the data, scientists, for example, don't think of themselves as being data gatherers. They think of themselves as being theoreticians and scientists, if you like, and that means they have to have the opportunity to exploit their own data. If they immediately gather the data and put it up on the internet, then the ones who would be publishing the articles on the data would be the people who got the access to the data secondarily. That's fine and it's desirable, and in a sense that would be good for research, but we're talking about human beings over here, and human beings that don't define themselves as professional data gatherers are not interested in giving their data away immediately. So there's complications with data. There's also complications with unrefereed preprints. We know that physicists and some other disciplines, economists and to a certain extent computer scientists, make their papers freely accessible online, open access, before they're even refereed. But you can't, that's not a universal. There are many disciplines where that's not done, and there's many disciplines where it's not even a good idea. I wouldn't want some sort of a quack cure for cancer to be broadcast all over the web before it was peer-reviewed in time, or some to cause some toxic effects on people's health. So all of these red categories have some open access elements, but the only exception-free domain is the green one on the left. Why open access? Now I'll read these out. It's to maximize the uptake, usage, applications, and impact of the research output of your university. And I'm speaking now specifically to policymakers. It's to measure and reward the uptake, usage, applications, and impact of the research output of your university, and that's research metrics, which I'll talk about. It's also to collect, manage, and showcase a permanent record of the research output impact of your university. That's the primary purpose. But I remind you that universities are seats of public learning, and therefore what Senator Cornyn says is also true, that in as much as it's obviously true for health research, everybody wants to read understandable health findings concerning the health of themselves and their loved ones. But in addition, there are other fields of research where technology, where the general public is able to understand and read the primary research results. They will also have access to it, and so it's not just for the primary practitioners, but the real benefit from the general public and the taxpayers comes from the fact that those for whom it's intended can then use it and apply it to their benefit. So open access, this is just buzzwords, maximizes the visibility, usage, uptake, applications, impact, productivity, progress, funding, manageability, and accessibility, evaluability by maximizing research accessibility. Open access how? By mandating green open access self-archiving. Metrics, that is the signs of the impact of research, motivate mandates, and mandates, of course, maximize metrics, because when you make your work open access, as I'll show you, you maximize its impact. I won't, in order to get to my 15-minute discussion time, I won't go through every word that I had here. To summarize now, how to provide open access: universities mandate green open access self-archiving. Deposit where? In universities' own institutional repositories. Deposit how? A few minutes of keystrokes per paper is all that it takes. Deposit what? The author's final revised peer-reviewed draft. And deposit when? Immediately upon acceptance for publication. As I said, there's two ways to make work open access. One of them is for publishers to convert to open access publishing, and the other, green open access, is for researchers to self-archive their final drafts. There are, in fact, several subdivisions. Please don't worry your head about these unless you're really enthusiastic about terminology. But there's not only green and gold open access, there's also gratis and libre open access. I've been talking, and I will continue to talk, about gratis open access, which means free online accessibility. You can have that in green and you can have it in gold. And most of the gold open access journals that simply make their online version freely accessible are gratis open access. Libre open access is more than that. And Libre open access will come, just as publishing reform will come and copyright reform will come. But it's not nearly as urgent as gratis open access. It includes gratis open access, but in addition, it gives further permission for reuses. I would say that the same thing I said about book authors, that not all book authors want to give away their texts for free. Some of them would like to get royalties. In the same way, not all text authors are interested in having others able to make derivative works out of their work. Many will, and most should. I can't see why not, but not all do. And I think it's important for the progress of open access to stick to the exception-free core first. Don't overreach. Don't reach for stuff that isn't urgent and that people are likely to object to. Researchers will never object to having their published, refereed articles accessible not only to those who can subscribe to them, but to everybody. But they may object to having to give permission to do certain things with their articles that normally authors don't want you to do, which is to cut and paste it into an article of your own, for example. The economics of this issue, which don't interest me directly, and they shouldn't really interest you, but are nevertheless relevant even to becoming a first-tier university, have been reviewed by John Houghton of Australia, who did a lot of modeling about the costs of golden open access and subscription-based open access. But the most striking conclusion of his analyses, which are mostly about publishing, which I'm not here to talk about. I'm not talking about publishing. I assume that people publish or perish. They publish in these journals. I'm talking about access. But in his joint authored work, he did some estimates on the savings on serials, budgets, et cetera, from conversion to golden open access. And one of the most striking outcomes was that the biggest saving, the biggest cost-benefit ratio comes from something that isn't even about publishing. It's about it's about green open access. If you make all of your research articles, published research articles, freely accessible in their final form, you make a 20-fold benefit. You derive a 20-fold benefit over the cost, which is really minimal. Pardon me, a 40-fold benefit. I'm even, rather than exaggerating, I'm even minimizing these benefits. So I will only be talking about gratis open access, and I'll be talking about gratis green open access. And I think that's what you should be thinking about when you're making policy as well. How do you provide it? Well, this is the normal research cycle. You start with, let's see if this works. You start with doing the research, then you write up the the results in the form of a preprint, and you submit it to a journal. The journal sends it to referees to be adjudicated and make recommendations on whether it's acceptable or what revisions have to be made. Sometimes several rounds of re-refereeing have to be done. Wendy, do you recall whether you had to go through re-refereeing? Was it? So usually there's several rounds of re-refereeing, and when there's finally a final draft is accepted, it's copy edited, courtesy of Sandy Thatcher, and then it's published both online and on paper, and then the next research cycle can continue, where you have the uptake of what's already been done. Now, open access. What's green open access? It simply takes what we just saw there and adds to it one step, which is that the final referee draft is deposited in the institutional repository. As a consequence, you have much more access, because now everybody who has online access at all, which now is virtually every researcher on the planet, has access to it, and that maximizes impact cycles and the impact of the research. And now and that's why open access is so important. It's for the progress and productivity and applications and impact of research. I've already said this. How can it help UNT become a first-tier university? I hope this is what you're about to see will give you an idea. Here is a histogram of this is not citation impact. This is actually the International University Rankings. This is about university-to-university links. And if you look at the structure, it's similar to the kind of thing that PageRank uses on Google for deciding what to put as your top hit when you're doing a Google search. But as you would expect, MIT and Harvard and Stanford are up at the top. And lower down in blue, you'll find Cambridge and Oxford too. But then, at the 25th rank, unexpectedly, is University of Southampton. And I repeat, this is Southampton actually is a Tier 1 university, but there are lots of Tier 1 universities, and it's not 25th in the world, I'm afraid. But there it is, ranked higher than Yale and Columbia, for example. Why? Because the University of Southampton was the first university in the world to adopt a green open access self-archiving mandate. In fact, it was the School of Electronics and Computer Science that adopted it in 2002, 2003. And it gave it a competitive advantage. And I'm going to describe the open access advantage in a moment, but I want to first tell you what its components are. One of them is an obvious one, early advantage. This applies to publishing as well. The earlier you publish your results, the more impact they're going to have. But this is also true about access. The earlier you provide open access to research, the more downloads and the more citations and other indicators of impact it will accrue, and that's sort of intuitively obvious. In addition, what's less intuitively obvious, and is actually a controversial point, which I'll talk about in a moment, the quality advantage. The distribution of citations is such, this is called the Seglin effect. 90% of citations go to about the top 10% of articles. And a goodly portion of articles, anywhere from 25 to 40%, is uncited at all. This is just to give you an idea of where Wendy's article ranks in this hierarchy. The quality advantage is the following. Open access is an advantage to all articles because obviously if your article is less accessible, it has less of a chance to be used and applied and built upon. But there's some research that's not going to be used, applied, or built upon, no matter even if you stick it in somebody's throat. So open access won't necessarily work for everything, but it works especially well for the top research, and that's the quality advantage. And I'll show you that in our data as well. There's a usage advantage. So even for research that isn't cited, obviously, if you build work on someone else's work, then you're going to cite it. Sometimes the effect is intangible. It's something you've read that you've somehow taken up into the way that you're thinking and what you do later, and so you don't go so far as to cite it. But downloads pick up that sort of thing. So there's the download advantage, the usage advantage, and then there are two effects, and this is especially relevant to those who are aspiring to Tier 1. One is the competitive advantage, which is that right now, the comparisons we make between open access articles and non-open access articles are always articles that are in the same journal, the same year, those that have and have not been made green open access. Yes, there's an early advantage, and yes, there's a quality advantage, and yes, there's a usage advantage, but in addition, there's a competitive advantage because only about between 5 and 25%, I think I might have that in my next, sorry, hang on. No, I have it in a later slide. Sorry, this is not in optimal order. Only about 5 to 25% of articles are being self-archived. They have a competitive advantage besides everything else over the ones that are not being self-archived. If it were a level playing field and everything was open access, as I hope it soon will be, the competitive advantage will be gone. But right now it's there. And there are few open access mandates. So if you need no other take-home message, you who are not Tier 1 universities, that if a non-Tier 1 university adopts an open access mandate now, they're going to get an early bird start that's going to be gone if they're one of the last ones to shut the door behind them when they adopt the mandate, whereas it's a huge advantage that's available now. The other controversial one is the quality bias, and it should have occurred to some of you that it's not random what articles get self-archived. Authors that are ashamed of their articles, I was actually talking to someone yesterday, I won't name who it was, who was speaking about deliberately publishing in journals that are obscure so that not many people will read your article. So there are perhaps reasons for not wanting to make it open access, perhaps reasons for not wanting to publish it at all. But the reverse of this is that if you're proud of your article and you think it's going to be important, you're more likely to make it open access. And that produces a quality bias in favor of open access, according to which a certain proportion of the effect that I'm going to show you, the advantage of open access, is going to be due to this bias. Namely, authors will be self-selecting their best stuff to make it open access. There's no question that there is a component of that. There's also no question that, like the competitive advantage, it's going to completely disappear when everything is open access, right? But some of the critics of open access, and I regret to say that those, I won't name what the interests are, but those who have an interest in retarding the progress of open access have picked up on this quality self-selection bias and tried to say that no, you're not going to get benefits from open access. It's all just because the open access stuff is the best stuff anyway. We did experiments to show that that wasn't true. So here's the open access advantage. In every field tested so far, don't set too much store by the magnitude of these because they vary from year to year. But what you should notice is that when you compare articles that are in the same journal and year that are open access by citations with articles in the same journal and year that are not open access, there's always an advantage for open access. Its magnitude varies, as I say, by field and by year, but it's always positive, and it's always quite big, considering that, as I say, most articles have very few citations. Percentages like these can make an awful lot if you don't start out with 0, because 0 times 0 is 0. Now, the critique that I just mentioned the critique is made by some neutral researchers. For example, Michael Curtis, who's definitely, he's not even neutral, he's very positive on open access. In astrophysics, he has found that the open access advantage is accounted for completely by early access and self-selection. But that's because astrophysics is an open access field. Basically, everything in astrophysics is accessible to all active, the 7 or so journals that they have is already accessible to all active researchers. And so the only room for play there is early access, which is to say preprints. And those astrophysicists that make their preprints available even before publication get a lot more research impact. And yes, the ones who tend to do that are the ones who are proud of the research and not trying to hide it. And so all of the open access advantage in astrophysics is accounted for by the early access component and the quality bias. But is this true about other fields? Fields that don't self-archive preprints and that do have an access problem? We did a study, a natural one, which marries the agenda of this meeting, which is open access mandates, with this question of the open access advantage. Because the way to test whether the open access advantage is just a self-selection bias is to compare the size of the open access advantage for papers that are deposited spontaneously by the spontaneous choice of the author, and those that are deposited because the university has a mandate. And if the self-selection bias hypothesis, which is that the only reason open access articles are more cited is because they're better articles and because the better articles tend to be made open access by their authors, if that hypothesis were right, then you would expect that open access mandates would diminish the size of the open access advantage or eliminate it completely. And it turns out that they don't do that at all. The advantage is just as big for open access for mandated open access as it is for unmandated open access. These are the and moreover, there's a further effect. It's not just that it's have I got the I forgot to put in the transparency that would have illustrated what I'm about to describe. But I described the Seglin effect, which is the fact that most of the citations go to the top articles. This is the citation distribution for articles and for journals. It turns out that the size of the open access, I'm sorry I don't have the data for it, but the size of the open access advantage is much bigger for the better articles, not because of quality bias on the part of the author, as we've shown with the mandated studies, but because of a quality bias by users. Namely, if you have access to everything, if your access is no longer constrained by what your university can afford to subscribe to, but you have access to everything, then you're going to pick the best stuff to cite, and the best stuff is going to benefit even more from that than the less than best stuff. But everything benefits except perhaps the very bottom of this distribution. Anyway, enough about this. I'm going to also talk about other metrics. It's not just citations and downloads. Repositories can supply metrics, and they're very important for authors. You have to give carrots with the sticks. In fact, you don't even need a stick. All you need to do is formally adopt a mandate. And authors, and I'll show you why, authors will comply anyway, but it's nice to give them feedback on the benefits of it. And the repositories can provide distributions of sites, who's citing you, who's downloading you, where are the downloads coming from, how you're doing relative to other papers. This is a paper by some arbitrary author called Tim Berners-Lee at Southampton. And the statistics are pretty good there. Don't expect the same thing for all of your papers. This is the site-based engine that Wendy mentioned that Tim Brody, my graduate student, created. It's like Google, except that it's based not on links but on citations. It can give you the citations, author citations, paper citations, so you can rank papers by the citation rank of the author or the paper, by the hit rate of the author or the paper. And there are other metrics like hub authority scores, co-citedness, etc. Here's this is a vanity search for a paper by myself. Here's its ranking according to citations for paper, and here is the ranking for the same search in terms of paper hits. This is chronometrics. These will be increasingly important in the world of open access metrics because you want to keep track of what's happening in time. So you want to see how citations grow with time and decay with time, and downloads as well with time. You can look at their fields will differ in terms of whether they're rapid turnaround, quick uptake fields, or fields that, like history, where the uptake will be slower. All of these things will be relevant to research assessment and research evaluation. There are many, I haven't got time to go over all of them, but there are many new metrics around the corner. All they need and all they're waiting for is the corpus, the content on which to develop. So we need open access first, just like we need open access, green open access before we can have gold open access. We need open access before we can have open access metrics. And then all of these will develop. We have lots of repositories. That's not the problem. The problem is that most of these repositories are near empty of their target content. As I said, only 5 to 25% of authors spontaneously deposit their refereed articles. Oh, this is what I wanted to show you. These are the deposit rates for mandated repositories compared to the little one here is unmandated ones. This is the vast majority. The mandated ones, this is an earlier study, but there's the Southampton mandate, the CERN mandate, and the Minho mandate, and this is the deposit rate for unmandated repositories. Sorry, what have I done here? Yes, this is the growth rate of the Southampton repository, the one that got those anomalous results for web links. The first repository was Southampton. The first university-wide mandate, I have to concede, was Queensland University of Technology in Australia, and Europe's first university-wide one was Minho in Portugal. There are now 167 mandates in all. Over 100 of them are university mandates. Over 40 of them are funder mandates. This is Alma Swan's famous questionnaires. She's done these studies more than once. They're international and interdisciplinary, and they were before mandates came in. She paved the way by showing that researchers are in favor of mandates, and that most of them will comply willingly. Green and yellow are those who will comply in all of these countries, and the green ones are the ones who do it willingly. So they're virtually saying, no, I won't self-archive because I'm busy and I'm worried about copyright and so on and so forth. But if my institution or my funder adopts a mandate, I will deposit willingly. That was the survey findings, and then Arthur Sale went and actually compared mandated and unmandated repositories. This is an unmandated repository. The green is its annual research output. The red is its deposit rate. And as you see, it's not depositing. It's the usual 15 to 20% rate. This is another university with an incentive to deposit, but no mandate. So this is a repository, no incentive, no mandate. This is a repository plus an incentive. This is at about 30% deposit. And this is a repository that has a mandate. It makes all the difference in the world. Without a mandate, you're not going to have open access. How do publishers feel about it? Well, Karen Hunter was the first. Yes, I think I still remember that day when I received that email from Karen Hunter when she announced that Elsevier had gone green. All 2,000 or so journals of Elsevier went green very early in the game. So those of you who are accustomed to vilifying Elsevier, I want you to know that Elsevier is on the side of the angels and has been, I think, mainly because of Karen Hunter, from the very beginning. If there's a fault with the fact that there's not open access in the world, it's not with Elsevier. It's with the fingers of the authors of Elsevier articles who, even when they're given green lights by Elsevier, don't deposit until and unless it's mandated. And by the way, for those 37% of journals that have not, unlike Elsevier and Springer and the American Physical Society, most of the top, in fact, virtually all the top journals are now green in the sense that they've given their green light to authors to self-archive. But for those that haven't, the other option is to deposit anyway. The mandate applies to all papers. There are no exceptions. If you have a gray publisher, you still have to deposit, but you can deposit it as closed access, which means only the metadata are visible to all users. And then there's the fair dealing button, which is the reprint request. But if a user finds a paper that is not open access, they can press the button and insert their email address, and it sends an automatic e-print request to the author saying, I would like to have just as authors have been doing in paper for 50 years, I would like to have a single copy of your work for research purposes, and the author just has to click once and the thing is sent to the user. So that covers all university output. All university output should be mandatorily deposited, but not mandatorily made open access if the author doesn't want to, because the button will take care of that. The growth of mandates I've already mentioned. They're now at about, there are funder mandates, institutional mandates, and departmental mandates. They're at about 167 overall. There's also many in the works. We heard about Senator Cornyn's FRPAA. There's also President Obama's initiative for this, which would have the same effect. There are many adopted mandates. After the first round of mandates that I described, things were going swimmingly in Britain and in Europe, but the United States was rather sluggish, so was Canada, until Harvard adopted its mandate, and then all of a sudden things picked up in the United States as well. We now have Harvard, MIT, University College London, Université du Liège. Canada got its first university-wide mandate a couple of weeks ago at Concordia. So my only advice on that, as I said, is don't pay for, it's fine if you have spare cash, spend it on gold open access, but not until you've mandated green open access. for many, many reasons, which you can ask me about later. What's likely to happen after green? This is all speculation now, and I do it under duress, but people insist on asking what happens next. Will it turn out that the green open access, once green open access becomes universal, will it turn out that the green open access version is found sufficient by authors so that they don't bother anymore with the journals, in which case institutions may very well cancel their journal subscriptions and journals will have to downsize. And in my view, they're going to downsize to no longer providing the paper version, no longer providing the online version, no longer even providing content, but simply providing, and certainly not archiving and fulfillment. They'll only be providing peer review, the implementation of peer review. Peers referee for free, but the peer review is absolutely essential to peer-reviewed publishing. How will that be paid for? It'll be paid for on the gold open access model, post-Green OA. Institutions will pay out of their windfall cancellation savings. They have more than enough to pay for just the peer review, and right now they're paying with subscriptions for everything. And I think peer review, I haven't got time to talk about it, will take a no-fault form. It won't be, you won't be paying the journal that accepts your article for the peer review, because that includes a kind of a shoplifting surcharge for all of the articles that they reject, which costs money as well to peer review. So it'll be by the round. You'll pay by the round of peer review, and I don't think it'll be very much. The important thing to bear in mind is that in the Gutenberg era, for better or for worse, it was the publication tail that was wagging the research dog. But there's no longer any need for that anymore. To summarize, universities will need to mandate Green OA in their repositories with a few keystrokes of the final referee draft immediately upon acceptance. The button will take care of the things that you can't make open access right away. The optimal open access mandate is an immediate deposit. By the way, the proposed mandate here at UNT is the world's first optimal open access mandate. If you adopt this one, you've got the best one. Immediate deposit is required. Immediate open access is recommended but not required. Permission clause optional. Try to retain permissions if you like, but you don't have to. I do urge you, though, to make the deposit the official means of submitting publications for annual performance review. That's just a bureaucratic thing, which says when you're being assessed, the way to submit your publications is just to deposit it in the repository and, of course, implement the button. I've already said why. Here are some sources of information, very important ones. The EOS, OASIS, and Spark all have information on policy making. This is the EOS one. This is the OASIS one, and this is Spark's, represented here by Heather. And here are some links. I think I have enough time for discussion. Thank you.